Hello, everyone. I'm Mr. Baker. We're going to continue in my environmental science class talking about soil and land use. Specifically, we're going to talk about how we're using it as a nation here in the U.S. We are going to hit a little bit about global food use and soil use, but we're mainly specifically talking about the U.S. because we live in the U.S. and that data is much easier to find than the global data. If you're part of my class and have a copy of the slides, the link in the bottom corner will take you to our vocab list for the unit. I highly encourage you to start looking at that list and internalizing it as we're going to continue using that vocabulary this unit. Right. And as we talk about food and soil management, the first real question we want to ask ourselves is how are we as humans using land? Right. And we're specifically going to look at that use for rural versus urban versus suburban and rural settings. There's a typo on my slides, and I will change that after I get done recording this one. All right, so here in the U.S., that's what these numbers represent. Our main uses for land are for forests and ranges and pastures. Those are for the feeding of livestock, crops, so growing cereal grains and vegetation, not just for human consumption, but for fuel as well. Parks and preserves, that includes wildlife preserves and wilderness preserves here in the U.S. A lot of times those are national parks or state parks. And then after that is use for urban land, which is suburban and urban housing. Right? So not very much of our land, by contrast, is used in that way. And we'll look more at those numbers specifically pretty soon in this week as we delve a little bit deeper. Also, I have some more updated data than 2007 for those, but the actual percentages haven't changed that much. All right. And note that in this pie chart, each of those, like 33, 119, 50, those are millions of acres. So it's not 51 acres, it's 51 million acres, right? So depending on where you live, you might be classified as living in an urban setting, a suburban setting, or a rural setting. Most of the U.S.'s actual land is in a rural setting, but only about 30% of people who live in those settings or live in the U.S. describe themselves as living in rural environments. And this is a pretty good reflection on what those environments actually are classified as. However, we as a nation actually do this on a county or parish basis. Those are the same things, by the way. Parishes are counties. It's just a different word for them based on the state. Right? So if you look at this map, you'll see that the ones that are colored this dark greenish color are the urban centers. And if you look especially here in Ohio, you can see that those green centers are Cleveland, Columbus, and Cincinnati, with the suburban settings mainly along the I-71 corridor and up in Toledo and around a few other locations in Ohio. But if we look at a larger scale, we see places like Chicago, Los Angeles, and San Francisco. This is Las Vegas in Nevada, so it classifies the whole county as urban, even though it really only has one large city. Places like Seattle up in Oregon, and we've got pretty much every state capital gets classified as such. But a lot of times, that's the only place in the whole city that is really classified as urban. Everything else is either suburban or rural. And a lot of times, suburban gets split between urban and rural if you ask the Census Bureau what that actual county is classified as. It's usually classified more as rural than urban. But this is a much better actual reflection of what those look like, because as we'll look more in depth this week in my class, sometimes the Census Bureau has a little bit different definition than what most people would actually define their county as looking like. All right. Here in the U.S., since the 1790s, at the beginning of the U.S. Census Bureau's data, the shift in population has been from a rural setting to an urban setting. Right now, about 80% of the US lives in an urban environment. And once the 2020 numbers for the 2020 census have been updated, that will probably continue to be about the threshold is 80, 85. That's what it's starting to look like as far as the early numbers that I've been able to get a hold of, but they haven't been nicely codified into a graph like this one. So you can see that over time there has been an urbanization in the US population. They've shifted away from living in rural settings, small towns, or in the middle of nowhere by themselves, to larger cities or in the outskirts of those larger cities that get still classified as urban. Right? If we look at land use specifically in the US, we'll get something that looks like this for the world, right? And we're going to talk about arable land. That's land that can hold and release nutrients to the plants that are going to grow on it. It can hold water, but not too much water so that it becomes flooded, not enough water so it becomes more desert-like. Desertification is a problem. We're going to talk about that next session, right? So fertile soil, right? Places that you can grow actual worthwhile crops on, right? So if we look at the whole of Earth's surface, only about 29% of it is land. 71% of it is covered by ocean, salt water. Definitely can't grow stuff there. You can grow things like kelp, but that's not as much of a crop as what we're generally talking about. If you look at the land surface, much like we talked about the useful amount of water when we were talking about water resources, looking at the land surface, only about 71% of it you can safely live on and grow crops with. 10%, about 10% of it is covered with glaciers or ice or permafrost or snow cover year round. 19% of it is places where crops just won't grow, like deserts, right? If we take that habitable land and we actually look at how it's being used, about 50% of it globally is being used for agricultural purposes. That's growing crops and raising livestock, animal husbandry, right? 37% of it is in forests, and then the rest of it is going to be bundled up between freshwater resources, urban use, and shrubbery, which is smaller, shorter plants that don't classify as forests. A lot of times grasslands also get thrown into the shrubland. If you're thinking about what types of lands would classify as shrubland, right? And then if we continue breaking up the agriculture into livestock and crops, most of it is going to go towards feeding and raising livestock, whether that is actually food that's being used for the livestock, if it's range land, pasture land, that kind of thing. 23% of it is for crops, right? So if we split that up farther, into the food caloric supply for global consumption and food protein supply, you'll see that while 33% of our protein is from this livestock, 17% of the global caloric supply is from livestock, whereas the other 83% is from plant-based resources, and 67% of our caloric intake is from plants globally. That means most actual energy that humans need for survival comes from plants. Not to say you should or should not be vegan. We're going to stay away from those types of arguments for the purposes of my environmental science class. Right. In the US, looking at specifically the US, this is kind of the graph you'll see. I know this is a weird bar graph to look at. So on the x-axis, we've got the years that we have this data for from 1949 to 2007. So about 50 years, give or take. And the y-axis is billions of acres used, all right? And then the different colors represent different things. They're labeled. So again, we've got about half of it being used for agricultural land, just over half, it's like 60%, while 40% of that land can be considered arable, good for raising crops and planting feed for our actual animal use. So not all of our land that's devoted to agriculture is technically arable. Some of it is supported by the use of fertilizers and specific modern farming techniques that we'll get more into later down the road. Just wanting to introduce you to that concept, right? Non-agricultural land, the other 60%, is used by forests, special use areas. That includes places like airports and cemeteries, but also industrial use and defense locations like Army bases, Air Force bases, naval bases, that kind of thing. Urban areas take up a very small portion of U.S. land, and that's cities and suburban areas, right? Again, we'll go more in depth with those this week. We're just covering them really lightly today. If you look globally, however, you can see that most people live close to the equator, relatively close, give or take 24 degrees, and most of them live on a coastal region, right? So again, this is going to show us where those urban settings are versus the rural settings are, right? And if we look at this, we can also kind of see where most crops are grown or where crops aren't grown. So places that are covered with snow most of the year or are classified as deserts, most people don't live there. They don't want to live in places that are really hot or really cold. Some people do live there, but not a whole lot of people. This is color coded in people per square kilometer. So anything that is this lighter orange color is only 5 to 25 people per square kilometer, which is not very dense as far as most global actual ranges are going to show. Whereas we're going to see a lot more urban settings in the 250 to 1,000, and even a few of those hitting over 1,000. And generally, those are going to be either capital cities of states here in the U.S. or nations in international states. And then in India, China, and the Philippines, we're going to see large increases in population density in specific regions. And a lot of that is due to some actual factors that we're going to not go into because some of them are political and some of them are just way too in-depth for a high school course. All right, so in general, humans really only need air, water, food, and shelter to survive, right? You can't live very long without air at all. Without water, you're not going to get very far, about 3 days. Without food, you'll get about 10 days if you do have air and water. And in general, humans need a place to sleep, shelter from the environment that they live in. But if we look at a map like what we just saw, we're going to see a preference among humans for tropical and temperate zones. And most of the humans on Earth live within 24 degrees north or south of the equator. So they live either in the tropics specifically or very close to them. 40% of the population live within 100 kilometers of a coastal region. So on the coast or close to a coast, right? A lot of times this has to do with where resources are, where food is, where actual cities already are built up, where trade is able to happen between states or cities or nations, right? Because we live in a global economy now and we want to get our goods from everywhere, not just the place that we live. And we're going to go more in depth into what makes something fit for human living and what makes it unfit for human living in my class later this week. All right, so we looked a little bit about how we're using that land. We're going to go more in depth throughout this unit on land use and the good and the bad of how humans are doing it currently, as well as some ways that it could be improved. As always, keep learning and keep asking questions.